defined by inequality, cohesion, and worker agency. Now, before I start, really, I would like to make a quotation here, a quotation from an article written by Sauri Nathan. Of course, Sauri Nathan writes here about the 1857 revolt and talks about the India Office records. But when I read this, I felt it was so much apt for the work that I'm talking about here. Now, when you see the archives here, I would like you to see the ones which are in bold. The archives reflect only the views and cultural perceptions of the colonizer, neglecting to give the voice or agency. Here he's talking about the Bengali sepoys. I would like to talk about the workers. The workers have no voice in the records which I have actually used so much to do this work. And in fact, when you look through the records, it presents a power dynamic in which the actions and motives of the subaltern or the marginalized is completely obscured, if not wholly lost in the historical record. However, by utilizing the post-colonial and postmodern theory to read or reread records against the grain, archivists, that is in this talk, I have been able to shed new light on this event and bring forth the missing voice and agency of the colonized. And this practice of reading the archival records against the grain has a large impact on archival practice as well, as it enables archivists like us and users to rethink and reinterpret the document in their care. So definitely talking about Indian labor through the archival sources was not easy. We had to read through the lines, in between the lines, and understand the position of the Indian workers. So this is what I have attempted to do in this talk. So let me just come to the first point that I would look into, that is the workforce composition and the administrative organization. Now, if you look at the workforce organization, we can talk about it as a dual administrative structure, which was overlapping. We have the European supervisory cadre over the Indian labor and also the Indian supervisory cadre, who also played a very important role. Now, let me talk about the European supervisory cadre, where we had at the top, we had a resident engineer. I mean, at the top means that the person who had direct contact with the workers. Every engineer you will see was aided by Indians. Like, for example, the resident engineer was aided by an Indian head clerk and two Indian assistants. Then under him was an assistant engineer who was again helped by two Indian office clerks. In fact, every engineer and every European overseer had an Indian interpreter to help them in carrying out their task. Now we go to the Indian supervisory cadre, who has played a very important role. So we first come to the person who is called as a Mukaddam. A force of workers, say around 30, 40 workers, they came under a person who was called as a Mukaddam. The Mukaddam is the leader of that force of workers. They organized the groups of laborers. They were accountable for the conduct of the workers and their work. They were responsible for return of all the tools and materials issued by the store. So this is the man who actually supervised the work of the workers. And on top, of course, we had the European cadre, but this is the man who actually did the groundwork with the workers. We also have a timekeeper, which is very new to this entire system. This timekeeper maintained proper time sheets to take time morning and evening. This was unknown before the coming of the railways in the Indian social fabric. Now you can see that these Indian intermediaries formed a very, very crucial layer in the labor control because they function as subcontractors within an emerging capitalist wing. But it is they who brought the workers into the railway construction. Now, if you look at the Indians who worked, in fact, from the records that I have got, there are categories that we can see. And you can see that there are certain categories who are called as laborers, which consist of men, women, and children. Usually the families came together to work in the construction site. We have carpenters, which are again divided into different forms like carpenter, masonry, sawyers, boat makers. We have artificers who are divided into three. We have masonry, the iron worker, the quarry worker. And we have miscellaneous workers like the plate layers, the fitters, the painters, the leather workmen, oilmen, messengers. You can see that it's a combination of skilled and unskilled workers. The first laborers would be called as unskilled, who definitely got the training here, and these are the skilled workers who got into this construction work. Now, I would like to talk to you about the gender dynamics. I just told you how families together came into this work as a workforce, and there's a data from 29 districts between Ahmedabad and Bombay. That was in 1860. And here I see the data that the number of men is now 9,791, women 7,510, children 3,376. The combined workforce of women and children is 10,886, which exceeded that of the men. So that is very interesting to know. And but however, there was wage disparities. For example, from a record, we understand that women earned one half to one third of a man's wage in Thana district. That was in Thane at that time. This is from what the record says. And the child workers, I've got records of carpenters and bricklayers who were children. And between the age of 10 to 13, they earned 1/5 of the adult wages. So you can see that railway construction relied heavily on underpaid women and child labor, which shows a deep structural inequality in the colonial workforce. Then, after we look into the structure, I would like to go into the question of recruiting labor. Was it easy to recruit labor? Was it easy to get the workers into the workforce? Definitely not. So let's understand how and where they got the workers. How did they manage? It was one of the major difficulty that the railway engineers faced. In fact, if you see the records, they amply talk about the problems that they faced. Why? The reason is that the workers that they recruited were primarily engaged in agricultural activities. This is the first time that we have a capitalist enterprise, and the first time where railway workers had to work at fixed timings. This is something, a new system which was being adopted by the Indians. Definitely very difficult for them to adopt such a system. So there were very few who willingly left their home and came for the construction work. And moreover, what we see is that there were instances where we see that the patils, that is the headman of the village, discouraged the workers to join the workforce. Well, the reason is not so much clear, but maybe in the next slide we could find out. In fact, you will see that getting the workers by the engineers was not easy. In fact, I told you they had no contractors. They recruited the workers on their own because it was a departmental system. So they had to get the local support. In fact, workers were very easily available in the Baroda region, probably because the Gaikwad rulers had a strong influence on the workers, and the Gaikwad rulers supported the building of the railways. But in contrast, there were villages like Kim, Ankleshwar, etc., where the parties disallowed the railways. They prevented the railways from and the workers from joining the railways. So what we see is that many a times the workers had to be acquired from the railway. I mean, from the headman, and the headman therefore often acted as a subcontractor or a subcontractor within this emerging capitalist system. So what we see is that it shows an environment where the capitalist and the pre-capitalist structures coexisted and interacted. Okay, so it's a very interesting phenomena where you're just having a capitalist enterprise being introduced in a pre-capitalist structure. Now, even if they got the workers, it was very difficult to retain the workers. The workers frequently left their jobs. Now, what were the reasons? Why did they leave their jobs? They returned to their villages during the monsoon seasons, especially for sowing activities. During the festivals, again, they disappeared. Especially, they had a lot of problems during the holies, and where laborers took leave and they never returned. Homesickness many a times discouraged many workers to come back to work. So these are certain problems that the railway engineers faced while the work was on. And therefore, Ian Kerr, one of the very well-known history of railway labor, that is, he's a very important historian. He labels them as the part-time proletarians. Now, another problem which again did not allow the railway workers to remain in the construction site is the impact of the epidemics. There were constant attacks of different kind of diseases, especially there's a mention of cholera, which created panic among the railway workers across the construction sites, leading to desertion of work. Now, if you look at the files, there are many such instances. I'll just mention a few to here, like, for example, Narmada Camp, where the Narmada Dam was being built in 1860s, Vasai Bridge in 1862, Daman Bridge in 1862, Vatruk and Mehsura in 1862. This is the place. These are the places where cholera struck the workers. Many died, and because of which the workers just left the work and left. And in 1869, of course, we have another interesting instance which I would like to share here. There was again a cholera outbreak in Narmada Bridge where the workers left. They fled the work there. But what is interesting is that during this time, the telegraph had become very important part of the communication. And through the telegraph system, the engineer could get 400 workers from Bombay. So they could be replaced, which was not so easy in 1860. So what we realize is that epidemics repeatedly destabilize the labor supply chains. But when we have technological improvements like telegraph, etc., there were quicker administrative responses to the crisis. Now, we will see that many a times it is, as I told you, the epidemics was a major problem. Another problem which, again, we see is that the railway, there were wage delays and that wage delay led to workers leaving the work. For example, I would give you one example here. There were delayed wage disbursement at Narmada in 1860. Again, I'm mentioning Narmada. And that was up to 12 days. There was delay in wage disbursement, and naturally, the workers were left in hunger and destitute, and therefore many of the laborers abandoned their work without receiving their pay, and this brought the entire construction work to a standstill. In fact, the company's reputation was deteriorated, and especially in a place like Mahikanta, from where the major source of which was the major source of labor, the workers stopped coming. In fact, the Patels, they insisted that the villagers should not go for this work, and in fact, the laborers who defied them were also excommunicated in the villages. So wage delays caused long-term harm to the railway company. In fact, let me tell you that BBCI Railway has taken a long time to construct the railway. They started in 1855, but they could never meet their deadlines. They were always late by quite a few years in opening their railway lines, and that was big. One of the major reasons is procurement of labor, and such incidents where there were wage delays, there was a loss of goodwill, difficulty in procuring labor, and disruption in the work. Now, the railway company also had to actually devise some strategies to secure the labor. So they tried to introduce some welfare measures. For example, they erected sheds in various places for accommodation. They engaged agents to collect laborers by paying advances. This is very interesting. There were advances paid, and the records say that when advances were paid, the workers, of course, saw to it that they came back to work if the advance has been taken by them. That is how, by paying the advances, they bind the labor to the capital. The workers, I mean, it was always insisted by the board of directors of the BBCI and also by the government that the British engineers should have a conciliatory attitude towards the Indian employees. In fact, anyone who misbehaved against the Indian employees were punished by the railway company. Looking into the scarcity of workers, naturally, this was very, very important. And many a times they also provided gratuity to families of workers who died in the accidents while on duty. So this is how they try to cajole the workers and try to bring them to the workforce. Many a times, when the workers were not available in the surrounding areas, they had to import labor. This especially happened south of Surat, that is towards when you go towards Bombay. So the reason was this area was mostly having unhealthy climate, because of which many workers stayed away from these sites. Even if the workers were paid 6 to 7 times higher wages than in the northern district, that is from Surat to Ahmedabad, whatever wages they received, there were 6 to 7 times higher wages paid down Surat. But still, it was very difficult to get the workers, and naturally, these workers, because They were few, they were at times unmanageable, they had to face unruly behavior. This is what the officers talk about. Therefore, they had to import. So there is instances where there were surplus masons from north of Surat who were moved to Daman-Ganga bridge. Then masons were brought from Nasik and Deccan. So, and not only this, they had to at times adopt the small contract system, which was against the departmental system. So this had to they had to shift from direct to mediated labor recruitment because of the scarcity of labor. So labor scarcity is a major issue in this railway construction that we see. Now, very interestingly, in spite of this railway, I told you that major work was the major higher positions were occupied by the British, and they were given a higher scale of pay. And therefore, there was an idea that that the British company should try and Indianize the skill post and train the Indians. So you will see that because of the higher salaries, they tried to replace the Indian staff, and therefore the government of India as well as the BBCI Railway decided to teach the Indians complex technical skills. And they insisted that Indians should replace the Europeans. For example, when James Marshall, who was a fireman, died in 1859, the company said that he must be replaced by an Indian. And therefore, plans were there to train the Indian drivers. But when you look at the records, there are a lot of doubts which were raised. There are racial doubts that persisted, that, Indians lacking nerve, their inability to handle crisis. Such things are, written in the records talking about their biasness about the Indians. In fact, you can see that British officials often held racialized assumptions about the workers' ability, their honesty, and their morality. For example, the Anglo-Indian newspapers and officials reflected imperial arrogance and cultural hegemony. Archival records repeatedly show these negative perceptions and systemic bias, which shape their attitudes towards the Indian labor. For example, I've given you some examples from the records that I've found. Like, for example, J.B. Hayes, who was the traffic manager of the BBCI, claimed that the laborers are unfit and characterless for important duties. J.R. Duxbury was another traffic manager, his successor. He blamed the accidents on the habitual carelessness of the Indians. H.F. Hancock, who was a deputy consulting engineer, he reinforced stereotypes about the recklessness of the lower orders. Even when some worker did good job, instead of, complimenting him, there is a backhand compliment. For example, in 1867, when pointsman Siddhar Rousseau correctly signaled the danger due to a derailment, he received a backhand compliment by the station master Anderson, who remarked that very few natives show such presence of mind. Okay, so this is the biased attitude that they had towards its Indians. Now, I would like to share an example of a particular person, that is Vishnu Balwant Rao. I tried to trace him in the archival records right from 1855 to 1867. And what do I see? You see you see that a talented person, refused refused to get, he was refused promotion because he's an Indian. Like, I would just like to trace his career. He joined as a clerk in 1855. He rose as a deputy accountant in 1859 because of his good work. 1862, he became the acting accountant, but not the accountant, acting accountant, because of his honesty and diligent service. And then he got paid, although he was working equally to that of the Europeans who were paid 350 to 400, he was paid only rupees 220. Promotion was denied to him. In fact, the deputy consulting engineer rejected his promotion. J.B. Lane, the managing agent, actually wanted to get him promoted, but it was rejected, insisting that a post like an accountant should be held only by an European. And the salary of this Vishnu Balwant Rao was raised only by rupees 80. And that is how Vishnu Balwant Rao later, frustrated, he resigned in 1867 in protest. So this reflects how racial stereotypes justified excluding Indians from higher posts regardless of their competence. But very interestingly, there are certain positions where, the Indians were, recruited. For example, in lower or semi-skilled roles like machine men, turner, the foreman posts were reserved for the Europeans. Um, uh, I mean, but just posts like machine men and turners, we did have some Indians who were recruited. Station master's job was usually given to Indians because of their language proficiency. In fact, if you look through the native newspaper reports, the Indians preferred Indians as station masters because it was easier for them to communicate. So there are quite a few station masters who were recruited as Indians. And the company trained Indians to avoid costly European appointment. For example, we saw Vishnu Balwant Rao, who became the acting accountant, so that, they didn't have to appoint an accountant really. And then we also see that Indians were trained as telegraph signaler apprentices. So certain positions were given to Indians, but not many positions, because they were doubtful about the proficiency of the Indians. Here is another interesting thing which I would like to highlight here. There were preference to intermediary communities in the colonial railway administration. For example, the European, the individuals like Pereira and De Costa, these are Christian surnames, you can see, they were considered to be more competent for European correspondent clerk positions. Now, these communities were probably employed as intermediaries between Europeans and Indians. These appointments reflect that the company's aim was to reduce cost, one, okay, by taking up Indians, and two, a colonial preference for communities perceived as more Europeanized. So, like for example, as noted by many scholars like Laura Baer, preferences have helped racial hierarchies within the bureaucracies. So the case mirrors the status, like, it's just like how Anglo-Indians were elevated to higher position. The same way you can see here, Christians were also given higher positions. They were more trusted than the other communities. So these practices show how the railway administration used community and cultural affiliations as tools of governance. Now we look into the protests by the railway labor. Not many examples, but here and there we do find large examples of workers moving away, resisting, not passively accepting this unfair treatment. For example, in early Feb 1860, the coolies staged a strike without notice demanding higher wages. I'm using the word coolies, which has been used in the records. Then there has been collective opposition to the new system in 1858. When a new system was introduced, they refused to accept it. Even when new equipments are introduced, for example, brass molds were introduced, they refused to accept the brass molds. So there were constant shortages and safety concerns because of these protests. For example, there were persistent labor scarcity because of protest in the Narmada Viaduct. In fact, the engineer H. Hogarth, he tried to replace the workers by bringing workers from Baroda. In 1860, again, there's an example of a fatal accident which happened in Narmada Bridge, and that led to so much of anxiety, leading to mass-scale exodus by the workers. So this is how the workers, you can see that these protests indicate that the Indian laborers actively negotiated, resisted, and shaped their working conditions within the colonial railway system. Now we go to the next, that is the pay scales. If you see the pay scales, they were, they varied from region to region, time to time, and the type of work that they did. It was typically 2 to 3 to 6 to 8 annas per day. The labor was costlier, as we have seen, south of Surat because of the scarcity of the workers. At times it was 4 annas per day in Thana, for example. And sometimes there was competition because of which they had to pay a higher wage. For example, when the Back Bay Railway Reclamation Company employed the plate layers at a pay of 10 to 11 annas per day, the BBCI workers left their work and joined the Back Bay Reclamation Company. So that is how even the railway company, that is the BBCI, also had to increase their wage because of the competition from Back Bay Reclamation Company. But here I would like to share a table with you. This shows the this shows the disparity of wages in locality wise. Now here I would like to show you the wages that were, then given to the GIP, that is the Great Indian Peninsula Railway Company, by the BBCI, which I'm talking about. And this, in fact, in the Bombay Presidency, there were 3 railway companies working almost simultaneously. So we have the GIP railway, who paid a little higher salary than the BBCI. So if in the BBCI, if you see the salaries, you can see they are lower than if you compare it to the GIP, but the highest salary was fetched by the workers working for the Sindh Railways, which was in Karachi and Kotri. So the Karachi workers had the highest pay. The highest wages were given to the Karachi workers. So this is an interesting table which shows the kind of disparity that you have in the wages depending on the company which was carrying out the railway construction, also locality wise. This is another table which shows the disparity of wages between India and Britain. Now, you can see here that there is a comparison here. This is the masons, the bricklayers, the carpenters, miners, excavators, laborers. You can see that there is quite a bit of disparity between the workers of Britain and Bombay. In fact, the table demonstrates that the wages of the Indian workers were only a fraction of the English wages. Now, what is the argument by the Europeans? The British engineers said that advanced an argument in support of this difference, and they blamed squarely the poor quality and quantity of work accomplished by the Indian labor. Okay, so they felt that this is justified because the Indian workers did not give the quality and quantity of the work which they got from the British labor. Now, I would try to quote something here and explain how what was the colonial attitude towards this lower wage, very low wage given to the Indians here. So there were biases against Indians that fed to the disillusionment of white supremacy are expressed by the author in the article Railways in Western India. This is an article which is in a journal. And what do they say? They, that is the Indians, are feeble and want those comforts which are essential to health and the fostering of their strength and vigor. The consequences are that their effective labor is often diminished by sickness, and even at the best of times, they fall very far short of the English standard. So this statement reveals how colonial narratives systematically framed Indian labor as inherently deficient. So by justifying wage discrimination, it reinforced the ideology of racial superiority that underpinned the colonial economy. So I would like to conclude here. So the BBCI railway construction was not only an engineering achievement, but it was a major social process. We see how the the capitalist enterprise was being established by the railways. And this labor, the Indian labor especially shaped this project through hierarchy, negotiation, conflict, and collective effort. Men, women, and children, they form the core workforce under conditions like low wages, seasonal disruptions, epidemics, racial and managerial bias. And what we see is that the workers were not passive. Many a times there were resistance which took many forms. Like, for example, they went on strikes, they refused to work. Many times they deserted their work, and therefore there were everyday acts of agency. And therefore, the labor story reveals the intersection of the colonial capitalism and the local social structures. So, understanding labor exposes the lived experiences behind the railway's construction. So infrastructure is not merely material, it rests on human labor, the struggle, the resilience, and their aspirations. So recognizing these histories honors the workers who made this monumental project possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bandyopadhyay. This was very, very insightful. And I'm sure all of us are thinking about infrastructure and about, the shining beacon of the railways, which was a huge British achievement, supposedly, in a very different light now. There are lots of questions coming into you in the chat box. So if everyone's okay, I'll just take the questions in the chat box first, and then we can take on. I'll throw the floor open for more questions. So Parag is asking about, is it right that when we say that BBCI and GIPR, like the Light Railway Line, were also private ventures? These companies were SPVs initiated by private investors, or were these government-sponsored uh, uh, railway just to get a sense of that?
Yeah. These are completely private ventures. The BBCI is a private venture. It was a stock holding company and which carried out this work. But what is interesting about the railway companies in India is that all the railway workers, all the railway companies, they got a 5% assurance of 5% interest. Okay, so what we see is that although the railway was completely managed, it was run privately, but they were supervised by the government. That is how, we get the records, the government records, because anything and everything that they did, they had to take the permission of the government. Why? Because the government gave them a guarantee of 5% interest. Okay, so whatever, even if there was a recruitment that had to be done or anything for that matter, even if they had to, get some material, everything had to be first permitted by the government, and then only the railway company could go ahead. But yes, it's a private public enterprise in that sense, because of course the investments were by the private company, but as you see, it's an investment where there is no risk, because the entire the 5% interest, which was borne by the Indian taxpayers, naturally made this like a public enterprise. So we have the government and the railway company together working into the construction.
There's also a follow up on this that so if you can get a sense of when did the government sponsored railway start, or did these continue to independence and then they were taken over, or
No, no, no. Actually, it didn't continue till independence, of course. So what happened is in the railway companies, when these ideas of having a railway in India was started, there were a lot of discussions which went on for decades. And they were the British were very reluctant to start railways in India, because they were not sure about its profitability. And it was Lord Dalhousie who insisted that the railways had to be built, so that, one of the major reason is to fulfill the economic needs of the cotton industries in Britain. That is one of the major need which is talked about. And then what happens is, the first company which got this guarantee of 5% interest was the GIP, and that is the Great Indian Peninsula Railway, which has built the Central Railway Line, okay, in Bombay, and then it goes ahead to it joins Kolkata and then Chennai also. And we also have the Eastern Indian Railway, which started its work from Bengal, from the Bengal President. So these are the two first railway companies which got this guarantee from the government. Of course, then there were other railway companies also which followed. BBCI is one of it, which started its work. It's again this BBCI. It started its work from 1855. The contract was signed in 1855. Now, because of this, because of this guarantee system, naturally there was a lot of wastage of money, and most of these companies were running at loss. They hardly had profits because they had this 5% interest guarantee, and somewhere the extravagant expenditure that the railway companies had, due to which there was hardly any profit, and there were doubts raised about the profitability, and about this kind of guaranteed companies. So from 1869, the doubts started being raised, and slowly by 1830s, the government started taking over these railway companies. 1930s, sorry, 1930s, the government started taking up the railway companies. And of course, after independence, the Indian government took it over completely.
A couple of questions on Mumbai specifically. So there are lots of flyovers that run over railway lines in Mumbai. So the question was, were these constructed by the BBCI itself, or maybe the engineering design was done, but they were contracted outwards? So just trying to get a sense of that. And also, what were things that were imported for these? Were the rails imported? Were the locomotives? So again, trying to get a sense of that.
Okay, so when you talk about the railways, yes, there were certain bridges also which were built. You know, the Kennedy Bridge, which we talk about, is built during this way. There are many such bridges which were built. In fact, you have large number of bridges which were built during. In fact, BBCI as such ran parallel to the sea, and
Right,
because it ran parallel to the sea, there were so many streams that they had to cross. So the
right,
largest number of bridges have been built by the BBCI, and let me tell you, the BBCI is one of the most expensive company. I mean, most expensive railway. And the reason for this is the large number of bridges that they had to build and rebuild. Okay, many a times we feel that if the British has built something, it is like steady, and it's like for it is it's very good quality. But no, there are number of examples where the bridges had to be built and rebuilt. So large number of bridges have been built by the BBCI, which made the BBCI railway very, very expensive, one of the most expensive railway. And regarding the material, everything was imported. Everything, each and everything was imported from Britain. Okay,
okay.
many a times, of course, they experimented with the sleepers. The sleepers were from the wood, which were again by cutting down the forest of India. But many a times, even then, they were not satisfied with the Indian wood. Even sometimes, the wood were imported. Everything, even the coals were at times they were not satisfied with the coal here.
Oh,
Everything, even the steel. And in fact, there was the railway which was built in by BBCI. We had the system, the bridges were called as the Warren Girder Bridge. Now, what is this Warren Girder Bridge? The entire bridge is actually made in Britain, and it's just brought to India, and they have to just screw the bridge. So that is all. So this is how the entire thing was brought, and so that you can see the railway construction. In fact, there are large number of historians who have talked about the drain of wealth which happened because of the construction of the railway. Okay,
wow.
so every material that was brought was mostly from Britain.
I understood. So a couple of more questions here, and again, Bombay related. Why did, though we have a couple of stations like the Parel Prabhadevi, etc., where both the central and the western lines are very close to each other, why is it that they don't actually connect?
Yes, there were actually a lot of discussions on this. I mean, when you look at the records, there was a discussion about how we could have one common terminal point for both the BBCI and the GIP. Already the GIP was, had started and working, and there was a proposal that the BBCI could connect with the at Bori Bandar. But maybe that was very prudent on their part to not really join the two lines, because at that time also they realized that this may lead to heavy traffic, and they might not be able to manage the crowd. So this was what was speculated then. And
Right.
of course, that's absolutely true. We just can't imagine two railways having the same lines, because if they had merged, the crowd would have been probably more unmanageable. So that's how we have two terminal points. And another interesting thing is that BBCI went up to Kolaba. It was later that the Kolaba terminal was closed and the Churchgate was built. But initially, it went up to Kolaba. So the main purpose of BBCI was to connect the port at Kolaba, so that the cotton which was brought from Gujarat could be directly exported from I mean, it brought to the Kolaba and then exported by ship to Britain.
Right. Moving on, there are a couple of questions on. I think they're both related to labor, so I'm going to take both of them, and maybe you can answer them as well. So one was, uh, is the you mentioned something about railway engineers being short, not enough being available. So was that partly due to the fact that there was housing projects on in Mumbai at the same time, and maybe these were more preferred by the engineers because better living conditions, maybe wages. So that's one. And the other one is going on the other side and asking about the victims of the epidemics that you mentioned. So, were these mainly women and children in the labor class of the railways? And also, were there any healthcare provided for them? So, just a question on both of these.
Yeah, Yeah, that's one thing is when I say paucity of labor in this talk, of course, I have spoken especially about the Indian labor,
Mhm.
and it's in the when I talk, of course, you have asked a question about the paucity of labor in the context of the Europeans, right? The engineers.
Mhm.
Were the engineers right? This is the question you asked.
Questions on engineers. Now, it's not, I understand that, of course, at that time, engineers were all European, but yeah.
Yes, they were all Europeans. They were absolutely all Europeans, and they were brought from Britain. And there was a regular supply of European engineers in India. And but let me tell you, life for them was very difficult. And we also get records where there's large amount number of deaths among the uh, European workers. Okay, because the climate was did not suit them, so they had to be replaced again and again.
Right.
And that really created a lot of problem again for the railway company, replacing the engineers with again new sets of engineers, because many a times many engineers could not survive, the weather. There are large instances of deaths occurring among the European engineers. Okay. But yes, they did come, but with a high wage. In fact, I told you how they doubted the Indians as drivers. So most of the drivers were Europeans. So the European drivers had to be paid a huge amount to attract them to India. And they were given double shifts so that, they could earn a higher salary. In fact, there were doubts raised about how you could give drivers double shifts, because that could lead to accidents. Okay, but then it was also said that if you did not give them double shifts, they were not happy with the kind of salary. I mean, the salary that was given to them. So they, of course, were given high salaries, and that is how they were brought into the railway. And
Right.
another question which you asked was
With
the
healthcare.
cholera epidemics. When I talk about the cholera epidemics, it's not just the women and the children. It is, anybody and everybody who were affected. The workers did not have very good conditions of work. Of course, as I told you, the railway engineers later tried to cajole them by building small temporary sheds. And regarding the medical facility, we have some interesting instances where, there was an engineer whose name was Jacob. He was an engineer, of course. He was not a doctor, but he practiced. He knew some medicine, some little medicine, and that is how he used to be the doctor for the engineer. I mean, for the workers there. And very interestingly, these workers trusted Jacob more than the Indian doctors. Okay. And then slowly, what happened is in Surat, there was a small hospital which was built. It was a makeshift hospital initially for the railway workers. And then there were some Indians who were trained as doctors, and they were given training for European training
Okay.
for being doctors. That is, the railway workers, no, they did not trust the Indian medicines. That is one thing very peculiar, and they trusted the Western medicines, the
Mhm.
allopathic medicines, and therefore, but there were Indian doctors who were trained by the Europeans, and these Indian doctors used to go in the line. They used to go around the line, I mean, go up and down the line to give medical services. So there was, and they had to be given medical services, and there were Indian doctors who were trained later. But still, what we see is that the Indians trusted the Europeans more than the Indians when it came to medical facilities. So this is a very interesting fact that I have gone seen in the records.
And, in line with this, one of the questions is that by working in these projects, did the workers see a substantial increase in their quality of life, or considering that they came in from other places to do this?
Yeah, now when you look at this, as I told you, I have looked into this records, which is the archival records, the books, and other contemporary sources. Now, if you look at the records, which is the British records, you will see that, for example, Julian Danvers, he has every year we get reports of the railways, and Julian Danvers was the Secretary of State, and he gives these. He every year he has brought these railway reports where he talks about how the wages of the Indians increased because of the railways. And they
Okay.
say that the quality of life is also improved because of the railways. But that is what the British records talk about. But let us even look, beneath that. Like, for example, then if that is the case, if the workers had a better life, then why is it that the workers were not willingly joining the work? Okay, why there was always scarcity of work? So that is again a big question. But definitely, it's a complete different system which came up. The workers were never used to this kind of, capitalist enterprise before. This is the first time that they went from, a fixed time, working for a fixed time, getting the wages. And the wage, and they say that is the records say that the wages increased overall because of the railway construction.
Ah.
So all the carpenters, all the masons, all other workers also started getting, even those who are not actually working for the railways, got higher wages because of the competition of the railway construction.
Okay. So if not direct, then indirectly, there were benefits there for sure.
Yes.
Um, s- uh, were the BBCI shares ever traded on the Bombay Stock Exchange? The Bombay Stock Exchange, as it were?
Bombay Stock Exchange that came later. Like in the initial period, is not that it's in the Bombay Stock Exchange,
Right.
because Bombay Stock Exchange came later. But yes, during the cotton boom,
Mhm.
okay, I mean in that time, I mean railway, this BBCI or GIP, whatever you say, all these shares were not bought exclusively by the Europeans. Even the Indians had shares in these companies.
Right.
Okay, there are records where we find the Indians also having shares in these companies.
All right. So these railway lines that were they laid along existing pathways? And is there a record of railways buying land and, buying the land before laying the railway? I think, how did that all operate?
Yeah. Now this is see, the land was given free to the railway company by the government of India. And it was not the old line that was just taken up. There were no I mean they had to actually, there are there large few, I mean at least 2 years of survey was done to
Mhm.
determine the line of the railway.
Right.
And there were intricate surveys done, very minute surveys done to lay the line. And there are many records of how the farmers were at times given compensations when their farms were taken away, salt lands taken away, because this BBCI had to take away a lot of salt lands. And there are instances of such compensations that we find in the railway records. But these compensations were given not by the railway company, it was given completely by the government, because the land was given free to the railway company. So again, to encourage them to come and take up this enterprise in India.
So Vinita has missed she's I believe she's missed it. So what does BBCI stand for? Is her question.
BBCI is Bombay, Baroda and Central India Railway Company. This is the name of the company.
Right.
Bombay, Baroda and Central India Railway Company. This railway company had plans to build the railway from Bombay, going to Gujarat and then going up to, that is Malwa region, and then to Delhi. And of course, up to the north. They also had plans to go connect up to north, Shimla. So that is how the name comes, Bombay Baroda Central India Railway Company. In fact, let me tell you, the Gaikwad rulers were very much interested in building this railway. In fact, they even before the railway company came up, the Gaikwad rulers, came up with this idea, and then it was later this company which came up. And Baroda, I mean, by this Baroda, this railway then ran through the Gaikwad rulers' territories in Baroda also.
So a lot of appreciation for your talk coming in, and a couple of more questions. I'm going to again combine a couple of questions here. So one was, what was the morale and the attitude of the laborers? You did touch upon this. Did they see this as progressive work, or were they trained to work on equipment, machinery? You did cover a bit, but if you could just summarize. And also,
Can you please repeat the question? I didn't
what
get
was
you.
the attitude and the morale of the workers working for the railways? And did they see this as progressive work? And were they trained on equipment or machinery, or was it just unskilled labor? And also, with this, how much authenticity would you give to the British reports? Because that's your major source of information, right?
Yes, yes,
So,
yes. Let me tell you that when you talk about the attitude of the workers, Um, uh, See, again, as I told you, my main source is the British records, which are the archival records, which I have gone through, and of course, even the native newspaper reports. We have seen in the entire discussion that they were not always happy with all the decisions that were taken for them by the railway engineers. And many a times they did protest. Okay. And one of the protests was to go on strikes, or they deserted the work and they left the work. That was another way of showing their displeasure with the work. And but yes, in spite of everything, they did work in the railways, and that is how we have this railway bill, right? And another thing, another question which you asked was whether they were trained in equipment. Yes, yes, they have been trained.
Mhm.
And as I told you that, but many a times these trainings were not accepted. Like, for example, there are, for example, to carry the earthwork,
Right.
uh, there were wagons which were given to them.
Mhm.
But Indians never were comfortable with the wagons. They brought their families along, and they had the basket method. So they used to carry all the earth in the basket while building the embankments. So that is one example where we have this one striking example, and there are a lot of discussions on how the Indians declined to use the wagons and preferred the basket method. Another interesting I would like to tell you is that how they were given training for making bricks with brass molds.
Mhm.
Okay, earlier they were not used to that. They used to make bricks traditionally with wooden molds, and uh, initially there was a lot of protest to it. Some workers went on strike also, but then some workers who persisted with the brass molds, they could do a better job, and they could earn better because they were producing more bricks. And then what we see is that these brass molds later got accepted by all the other workers because they could get more profit, like they could earn more with this brass mold. So yes, there was training given, and even things like how the carpenter had to sit. That type of training was also given by the railway engineers. We have instances of how the carpenters resisted the how the engineers asking them to sit in a particular way. But then finally they took up or they accepted the orders of the engineers because it probably helped them to work better or do better. This is what the railway records tell us.
Also, could you, if possible, highlight if there is any contribution of both the Parsi communities as well as the Anglo-Indian communities to this whole enterprise?
Yes, regarding the Parsi community, as I told you, there are references to the Parsi communities, especially as as station masters. Okay, there are quite a few references that I've got where the Parsis acted as station masters, and Anglo-Indians not so much in BBCI, not so much in BBCI, but yes. In the East Indian Railway Company, which worked in Bengal, you have large number of Anglo-Indians. Laura Baer has written a complete book on that, and she's written a book, Lines of the Nation, Indian Railway Workers Bureaucracy. So when I read this, I got this idea of how there is this, there's divisions even among the various social classes in India. But here in the BBC, I don't see much references about Anglo-Indians. But yes, Parsi, I do find some. Especially as station masters, I do find some references of Parsis working here.
Hi. Thank you so much. Like I said, a lot of appreciation coming in. We have overrun the time, but if I may take a couple of minutes more, may I invite anyone else to ask if there are any more questions? I just thought I'll ask quickly. Yes, Nivedita, you'd like to say something? All right, no worries. I think mostly everyone has got their questions answered. Thank you so much. It's
Thank you, Khakila, for
very,
giving
very
me this
insightful.
opportunity and this platform to express myself and
So,
share my research with you. Thank you so much.
yes, and like I said, you've given everyone a very different perspective. And I think the next time we look at the railways, we're going to think about it very, very differently. So thank you so much for that.
Thank
Yes. All right, everyone. I'll be closing the session now. Thank you so much. Enjoy the
thank
rest of your weekend. Bye.
thank you.